Hello YouTube. One of the most famous and controversial papers in biology is the Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm by Stephen J. Gould and Richard Lewontin. In this video I'm going to examine some of the arguments in that paper, and in the next video I'll look at some of the recent developments in the debate. So the basic goal of Gould and Lewontin's paper is to attack adaptationism, or the adaptationist program, which they claim has been dominant in evolutionary thinking for several decades. According to adaptationism, natural selection is extremely powerful. Selection is the primary cause of almost all morphological, physiological and behavioural traits. Selection is the primary force in evolution, and organisms become optimally adapted to their environments. Since adaptationists view selection as the primary force, they focus mainly on the functions of different traits. They treat the traits of organisms as having arisen for some sort of utility, and then having identified what the traits are used for, they assume that this is why the traits are there. Organisms are viewed as divided into separate traits, and adaptive explanations are proposed for each trait individually. Now, there are, of course, imperfections, but these imperfections are usually explained as a result of trade-offs among competing selective pressures, or trade-offs among different traits. So any imperfections in organisms turn out to result from adaptation as well. So for example, I mean, maybe the optimum brain size, if you just consider the brain, would be larger, but then it would be too big to fit through the birth canal. So it's obviously constrained to a smaller size than would be optimum. We have a suboptimal part, but overall the human body is as near as good as it could be. Overall optimality is maximised by selection. So that's basically how the basic view of adaptationism as Gould and Lewontin see it. Brian Garvey, in his Introduction to Philosophy of Biology, claims that adaptationism involves two central reasoning strategies: adaptive thinking and reverse engineering. So when we engage in adaptive thinking, we consider the selective problems that a particular species faces, and then we try to infer what traits it may have evolved to deal with these problems. So in general, I mean, this kind of thing is quite easily testable. You look at a species, you think about what problems or potential problems it might face, and then you just come up with some trait that would solve those problems, and then you check to see whether the species has that trait. Second, there is reverse engineering, and here we reason in the opposite direction. First, we consider a biological trait, and then we try to determine what problem the trait was selected to solve. So we might notice, for example, that humans get goosebumps when they're scared. So why is that? Why do humans have goosebumps when they're scared? And then we think, well, once upon a time, our ancestors were hairy, and standing the hairs straight up made them look bigger and hence more threatening. So it kind of makes sense. If you're scared, then you're going to be then you're perhaps facing a threat. If you make yourself look bigger, that might make the threat go away. So we have a biological trait, and we've come up with a story that appeals to natural selection to explain why we have that trait. So let's outline Gould and Lewontin's arguments against adaptationism. First of all, they claim that adaptationism is unfalsifiable. Falsifiability is an important feature of scientific theories. We must be able to identify situations that would lead us to say that the theory is false. Otherwise, the theory is little more than dogma. Gould and Lewontin worry that the kind of arguments adaptationists offer make their program unfalsifiable. So they say that generally we find a pattern of reasoning along these lines. So the adaptationists will first assume that if one adaptive explanation fails, just try another. And obviously there's no limit to the adaptive stories we might be able to tell. Consider giraffes' necks. We might first suggest that these long necks were evolved to help to help access food higher in trees. Suppose that we then discover that actually this would have conferred no advantage, maybe because the food high in trees is already being eaten by other organisms. So then we say, okay, well maybe they evolved long necks to make them taller and so more frightening to predators. Or maybe they evolved long necks to be used in combat, or maybe they evolved long necks as some sort of sexual selection. Obviously, these adaptive explanations can just go on indefinitely. There's really no limit to any adaptive explanation we might come up with. A second sort of strategy is to say, well, if every adaptive explanation fails, just assume that one is true, we just haven't found it yet. And in general, they will attribute the failure to find an adaptive explanation to imperfect knowledge. Why do snails have different colours in the same environment? So if we look at different kinds of snails, we find that they have various different colours, even though they live in the same environment. Why is that? Well, because the environment isn't really the same. There are actually a host of subtle differences. We don't yet understand the differences, and perhaps in principle we never could understand all of the differences and the various factors that make a different environment, and this explains the differences in the snail colour. Obviously, you can always assume that there's just something we don't know yet. Finally, adaptationists will emphasise immediate utility and exclude other aspects of form. When we examine organisms, the adaptationist says we should ask, what is this part used for? We ask, what is the utility of a trait? We explicitly search for the functions of particular traits. And this focus on function and utility closes off appreciation of other perspectives, which again reduces the risk of falsification. So all of these strategies make adaptationism unfalsifiable. Second, Gould and Lewontin claim that the criteria that many adaptationists have for accepting an adaptive story are far too weak. So what they will do is, for some trait X, they will concoct a story in which natural selection accounts for the emergence of X. This is the reverse engineering strategy. And in principle, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but often merely telling a story that shows how the trait arose by natural selection is accepted as good enough. Right? You just tell a story, and if the story is plausible, it's accepted. As an example, Gould and Lewontin use David Barash's work on aggression in mountain bluebirds. Barash used a model of a male bluebird, and he put it near the bluebird nests on 3 occasions. First, before the eggs were laid, and then twice after the eggs were laid. He wanted to see how having another male near the nest would influence the male bluebird's behaviour. In the first case, male bluebirds displayed aggression towards the model and towards their female mate back at the nest. For the other 2 cases, they were much less aggressive towards the model and not at all aggressive towards the female. To explain this behaviour, Barash offers a fairly plausible evolutionary story, and he considers his work complete with that. Barash's basic idea is that if the male's partner cuckolds him before the eggs are laid, that's more of a problem because the male might then end up wasting his resources raising another male's children. But if his partner is adulterous after the eggs are already laid, well, it's no big deal because his genes are already inside the eggs. So there will have been selection for aggressive behaviour before, but not after the eggs are laid. I mean, that's a plausible story. It's nothing wrong with that as an idea, but as Gould and Lewontin point out, there are a whole number of other hypotheses that could account for the male's behaviour, which were never even tested. For example, and I quote, they say, male returns at times 2 and 3, approaches the model, recognises it as the same phony he saw before, and doesn't bother his female. That's also a plausible hypothesis, but Barash never performed the tests to rule out this hypothesis, such as placing the model near the nest for the first time only after the eggs were laid. Of course, this is just one example, but Gould and Lewontin think that biologists in general are too ready to accept any plausible selective story. One thing that's worth noting about these first 2 criticisms is that they're not really objections to adaptationism in itself. Rather, their objections to how some adaptationists practice it. And I think it's pretty widely accepted these days. Even the most ardent adaptationists have taken on these kinds of criticisms, and it's no longer the case that these are such problems. And indeed, arguably, they never were problems. When Gould and Lewontin first published their paper, many biologists objected that they had simply caricatured adaptationism, and that adaptationists didn't tend to make these kinds of errors. So let's move on to their objections to adaptationism itself. So third, Gould and Lewontin say that adaptationism entails atomization of organisms. Basically, the claim here is that adaptationism treats organisms as collections of independent traits, where each trait is seen as a solution to some problem posed by the environment. But this, they think, is highly misleading. Organisms are more properly viewed as whole integrated systems. By focusing on how specific atomized traits arise in response to environmental pressures, we obscure the way that the organism develops as a whole. And we'll explore this point a little further later in the video. I do want to point out, though, a related point here is that they think that adaptationists tend to ignore the problem of just how an organism should be divided into traits in the first place. So consider the human chin. We might be inclined to treat this as a separate trait, and then we look for an adaptationist explanation for why it arose. But in fact, it's just an effect of how the jaw meets the neck. Biologically speaking, it's not clear that the chin is a specific trait at all. Kim Stelney and Paul Griffiths give the example of mandrills, a type of monkey. They have striking blue muzzles and a matching blue on their genitals. Are these separate traits, or is this just one evolving trait? The overall mandrill colour scheme. The point is that we can't assume that every trait, no matter how they're divided, has an adaptive explanation. Selective forces will affect different aspects of the organism at different times. Next, Gould and Lewontin consider 5 alternatives to adaptationist explanation. The first point they raise is that traits can emerge as a result of genetic drift. Genetic drift is essentially a kind of sampling error. Imagine you have a large population of butterflies, shown here on the left. 50% have red wings, 50% have green wings. Then some natural disaster happens and only a few butterflies survive. And just by chance, most of them have red wings. It's not that red wings have some survival advantage. The red-winged butterflies just got lucky. Genetic drift is change that occurs just by chance. And the result is that populations will change and different traits will develop in the complete absence of natural selection. Indeed, even alleles that are highly advantageous are often lost just because the majority of new mutations, even good mutations, are lost by chance. Now, it's worth noting that drift has been a central part of evolutionary theory ever since the modern synthesis of the 1930s. So I sort of wonder if Gould and Lewontin are maybe overstating their case here. Literally every evolutionary biologist recognises the importance of drift. Gould and Lewontin don't discuss this, but I do wonder if their point about drift might be better supported by appealing to Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium. I won't talk about punctuated equilibrium too much here because I have a few videos on it, so you can go and watch them if you're interested in more detail. But the basic idea is that macroevolution, evolutionary change over a long period of time, follows a pattern of long periods of stasis punctuated by rapid changes. So generally speaking, for most of its evolutionary history, a species doesn't change that much. It stays basically the same, and then you have these relatively rapid periods of change, followed again by long periods of stasis. And these periods of rapid change are often a result of genetic drift or a result of catastrophes. So, for example, when the dinosaurs were wiped out, there was a sudden radiation of mammals, and that caused sudden changes in the mammals. So we might think that looking at evolution over a long period of time, selection isn't responsible for the major evolutionary developments. Perhaps processes like drift and chance have more to do with it. And that is something that is more controversial. Second, they consider cases where there is no adaptation and no selection on the trait in question, rather the trait arose as a byproduct of selection on another trait. Gould and Lewontin call these biological byproducts spandrels. The term spandrel comes from architecture. Spandrels are found in various buildings like St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. They occur when you have curved arches with a structure on top of them. And when you mount something on top of curved arches, obviously you get these tapering triangular spaces where the arches meet the dome, and these are called spandrels. And they were usually painted with religious iconography. Often these images are especially striking aspects of the design of the building. Naively, when we look at these beautiful pictures in the spandrels, we might think that the spandrels were designed to accommodate the pictures. But in fact, the spandrels were not designed at all. They're simply a necessary structural consequence of putting something on top of curved arches. They are a byproduct of the design. Similarly, a biological trait, even a trait that's very useful to the organism, may be a byproduct of selection on other traits. Just as spandrels were not designed for the pictures, some biological traits were not designed by selection, as it were, for the use that the organism has of them. An interesting phenomenon in this connection is pleiotropy, where a single gene influences many traits. And so selection on one trait can lead to the others changing. An example is the panda's thumb. Pandas have a sixth thumb that arose as a modification of the wrist bones, and that was very likely caused by natural selection. But they have similar appendages on their ankles, and these were likely a byproduct of whatever genetic changes produced the wrist thumbs. We can imagine that pandas start using their ankle thumbs for various reasons, maybe to help them get food, and then an adaptationist biologist of the future might come along explaining that ankle thumbs were selected for that purpose. And they would of course be wrong. The thumbs just arose as a product of selection on the wrist thumbs. In general, repeated body parts, such as the counterpart bones of different limbs, are not controlled by separate genes. They're rather coordinated in development, so changes to one part will lead to changes in the other. Another important case is heterochrony, which refers to changes in the rate of developmental events. Two important examples here are progenesis and neoteny. So it may be the case that a species undergoes selection for early sexual maturity. They are selected to reproduce at an earlier developmental stage. So imagine the stages of development like this: A, B, C, D, and sexual maturity occurs at D, so the species reproduces at stage D. But then there is selection for early reproduction, and so reproduction starts earlier. Then the species won't pass through stages C and D. This is known as progenesis. So this is when reproduction occurs earlier, but somatic development proceeds at essentially the same rate. Alternatively, in neoteny, somatic development slows down while reproduction occurs at the same time. So stage B happens much later, while reproduction occurs at the same time. Obviously, this will have the same result. The adult form has the phenotype B, and it never goes through stages C or D. A famous example of this kind of case is the axolotl. The axolotl is closely related to salamanders, and adult axolotls have the form of juvenile salamanders. Adult axolotls have undergone neoteny. Now, it's obvious that if a species has undergone progenesis or neoteny, many of its features will not have been produced by selection. The phenotype of the species might change quite radically. I mean, very often juvenile forms of species are quite different to their adult forms. So there will be many changes in the form of the species, but this might just be a byproduct of selection for reproduction at an earlier stage of development. Biological spandrels can also arise as a result of a kind of linked processes of development. A good example are the male nipples. It might seem odd that men have nipples because they don't do anything. So you think, well, why did male nipples evolve? The most likely answer is simply because nipples are important in females, and men and women both share a developmental pathway as embryos. Male nipples are a byproduct of female nipples. Similarly, Gould suggests that the female orgasm is a byproduct of the male orgasm. The clitoris is the developmental homologue of the penis. There's obviously very strong selection for the male orgasm, again because men and women share a developmental pathway, and this leads as a byproduct to orgasm in women. If there is, basically in general, if there is selection for change in the body of one sex, that will likely lead to similar changes in the body of the other sex. And this, of course, all connects to the earlier point that organisms must be viewed as integrated wholes. They shouldn't be atomized. They shouldn't be treated as mere collections of traits. Many biological features arise as byproducts due to developmental or structural constraints. Gould and Lewontin then consider various cases in which adaptation and selection come apart. Now, one problem with this part of their paper is that we often say that an adaptation is a trait that arose as a result of selection. Adaptation is often defined in terms of selection. But Gould and Lewontin's point here is clear enough, I think. What they're saying is that selection doesn't necessarily produce complex useful traits, and complex useful traits can be produced without selection. So in the first case then, selection without adaptation. In earlier work, Lewontin gave an example of a gene for higher fecundity. Suppose that in a population of organisms that lay on average 10 eggs each, a mutation arises which doubles fecundity so they lay 20 eggs each. There's no change in resource utilisation, so the organisms leave the same amount of surviving offspring. The excess just die off. Lewontin says that this gene would sweep through the population. It would be selected for, but it wouldn't count as an adaptation in any sense. Now, I have to say I find this example rather strange. Maybe I'm just missing something here, but I'm really not sure how this could be a case of selection. It seems to me that a gene for higher fecundity could only be selected for if it results in more surviving offspring, but Lewontin specifies that the number of surviving offspring is not increased. In fact, in general, biologists are, they're well aware that there is no selection in general for higher fecundity, and the reason is precisely because it doesn't tend to produce more offspring. What happens when you have higher fecundity is that the greater number of offspring just die off, and so there isn't selection for that. So I'm not really convinced by this example. Second, though, they talk about adaptation without selection. So the idea here is that a good fit to the environment may be directly induced by the environment itself, without any selection occurring. So many marine organisms are well adapted to flow regimes, but their bodies have been shaped not by selection, but just by the water flow itself. The flow of water can alter their bodies, and so that gives them the well-adapted shape. In many cases then, it may simply be that the phenotype of an organism has enough variability that adaptation can be directly induced by the environment. The capacity for one genotype to produce various different phenotypes in different environments is known as phenotypic plasticity. So Gould and Lewontin suggests that phenotypic plasticity alone may account for some adaptations. Fourth, they say there can be adaptation and selection, but no selective basis for differences among populations. Different populations might develop different solutions to the same problem, and both solutions might be equally good. There is no optimum design, as it were, but various equally good options. Now, as with genetic drift, this kind of case seems to me to be very widely recognised by biologists. I don't think any biologist would claim that the environment constrains a species to just one optimum solution. So, I don't know, that doesn't really seem like any adaptationist would have a problem with this. Fifth, there can be adaptation and selection, but the adaptation is a secondary utilisation of parts present for reasons of architecture, development or history. Blushing, for example, may be an adaptation caused by sexual selection, but of course that doesn't tell us why blood is red. The redness of blood has nothing to do with blushing. Blood is red for other reasons, and it was then co-opted for its use in blushing. In later work, Gould introduced the term exaptation to refer to a trait that has a specific adaptive use but that arose for some other reason. The most famous example are bird feathers, which we think arose for thermoregulation and were later co-opted for flight. Another example is the lizard Holapsis guenetheri. No idea if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what we'll go with, Holapsis guenetheri. And this has a very flattened head. This flattened head arose to allow it to hunt in narrow crevices, and it later developed a secondary use as an aerofoil, allowing it to glide between trees. An interesting case known to Darwin is that these skull bones in the baby's head are not joined together until after birth, and that of course makes it a lot easier to pass through the birth canal. Was this an adaptation? Well, in fact, we find the same feature in many other animals, such as birds that don't pass through the birth canal at all because they come from eggs, and kangaroos that are so tiny when they're born that they wouldn't have any trouble anyway. So clearly this feature of the skull bones was inherited from a distant ancestor. It may have arisen as an adaptation in that ancestor, or it may not have done. One worry about this notion of exaptation that's just worth drawing attention to here is that an adaptation is always a modification of some existing design. And notice that, so in the case where we have a trait that's evolved for some purpose X, and then is later co-opted for something else Y, substantial modification of the trait to make it better for Y will usually occur. And that's just what we find in bird feathers. But bird feathers, now that they're used for flying, have been modified substantially. And those modifications would surely count as standard adaptations. So the line between adaptation and exaptation is rather blurred, and many people have wondered whether exaptation is a useful idea. Finally, Gould and Lewontin suggest that a different approach to evolutionary theory might be built by focusing on what they call the battleplan. Battleplan means building plan or blueprint. The thought here is that there is a basic design plan. There are a small set of basic design plans that are adopted by all species of organisms. The process of selection and adaptation produce modifications and additions to the battleplan, but these basic battleplans themselves are very difficult to change. They are highly conserved across a number of species. The number of basic battleplan is fairly small. On Gould's view, there was a rapid diversification of battleplan in the Cambrian explosion about 540 million years ago. All subsequent animals have been variants of the types that developed during the Cambrian. Battleplan are highly integrated, and they substantially constrain adaptation. For example, all insects have 3 body regions. They have the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. Now, it's extremely unlikely that 3 body regions is optimal for all insects. This body structure may have been an adaptation originally, but now it's a frozen accident, as it were, that in many cases is probably often suboptimal. And the reason why it can't be changed is that variation at the level of basic body organisation, variation in the battleplan, would severely disrupt development. So this idea of developmental constraint is an important part of what accounts for the battleplan. Adult organisms are the product of a long series of developmental stages. Early stages of development are extremely resistant to evolutionary change because any mistake at this level, and any mistake early in development, would cause cascading problems throughout development. So it doesn't matter how well adapted a particular phenotype would be if there's no way that it can be an outcome of the characteristic development of the organism. Any evolutionary changes tend to be modifications of what is given in early stages of development, and it's in these early stages that the basic body plans are set down. So this means that the basic bodily structure and basic bodily processes are highly constrained. It's not that insects with 3 body regions are optimal, rather the variation for change either doesn't arise, or when it does arise, if there was an insect that exhibited such variation, the basic structure would be so disrupted that the insect would it would just be severely damaged and wouldn't survive and reproduce so well. Indeed, even with more minor parts of the organism, we find these kinds of developmental constraints. The classic example is the vertebrate eye, which seems to be installed backwards. The photosensitive pigment is at the back of the retina, and then there are various cells that light has to travel through before hitting it. The axons of the optic nerve are sent to the brain, and in the part where they're sent to the brain there has to be a hole in the retina, because the axons of the optic nerve are on the outside of the retina and then go into the head, and that results in the blind spot. This isn't the case for other eyes in the animal kingdom. Cephalopod eyes are installed the right way round, and there are obvious benefits to having an eye that is installed the right way round. For one thing, there's no blind spot. But it seems unlikely at this point that the vertebrate eye could flip, because this may just disrupt development of the eye too much. Now, you might wonder whether this is really an alternative to adaptationism. I mean, after all of this can be explained, it seems, in terms of selection. With respect to insect body regions, well, we would say that variation in the body regions would, due to developmental constraints, make the insect much worse off, so much less likely to survive and reproduce, and so it would be selected against. That's an adaptive story. And we already noted how adaptationists recognise trade-offs. They recognise that some traits are suboptimal because they always have to be compatible with other traits. So isn't this just an example of those kinds of trade-offs? Well, on the other hand, though, it does seem like focusing just on selection misses something important in this case. The constraints imposed by the basic body plan seem to be deeper than mere trade-offs, and I think that's what Gould and Lewontin would want to say here. The point is that all of the millions of insect species are variations on this basic structure. I think Gould and Lewontin would want to say that we should view the battleplan as channeling selection in certain directions. So I quote, they say, "Change when it occurs may be mediated by natural selection, but constraints restrict possible paths and modes of change so strongly that the constraints themselves become much the most interesting aspect of evolution." So constraint, in their view, is a kind of positive force in evolution. It's not just something that kind of happens in the background. It's a positive force that actively channels selection. So that was Gould and Lewontin's attack on adaptationism. In the next video, we'll consider some responses, some different ideas in the debate, but that's all for today. Thanks for watching.